Welcome. I'm Jeff Carter. I go by he, him with Seattle CityClub. And again, welcome to this webinar on the housing crisis, part of our Civic Bootcamp on housing instability. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that Seattle CityClub is a small nonprofit with a big mission to strengthen our community through conversations with community leaders on critical topics like this one and encourage civic engagement. So please consider supporting us to continue programs like these by making a donation on our website, seattlecityclub.org. We value healthy dialogue and debate and want to provide a safe and welcoming space for all to contribute. In order to do this, we've established community standards for webinar communications, and we will not tolerate threats of violence, profanity, or hate speech. Those who violate our standards will lose the privilege of attending this webinar. So with that, I would like to welcome our panelists today. And if you'd like to share your personal pronoun, feel free. So first of all, Stephen Norman, Executive Director, King County Housing Authority. Rachael Myers, Executive Director, Washington Low Income Housing Alliance. Hello, Rachael. Patience Malaba, Director of Government Relations and Policy, Housing Development Consortium of Seattle, King County. That's a mouthful. Hi, Patience. And Tyrone Brown, statewide organizer for the Tenants Union. Hello, Tyrone. Why don't we just start with who you are? So, Stephen, why don't you start? What is the King County Housing Authority?
Well, the King County Housing Authority is actually a product of the New Deal. We are a separate municipal corporation that works on housing issues. We're one of three in King County. There's a Seattle Housing Authority that works with the city of Seattle. There's a housing authority for the city of Renton. The King County Housing Authority covers the rest of the county, both some 38 suburban cities as well as the unincorporated areas of the county. Just to give you a brief sense of what we do, we have really three lines of business. The first two are federally subsidized, and these are the public housing and the housing choice voucher programs. Collectively, these serve about 14,000 households at any one time. Public housing is housing that we own and operate. The Housing Choice Voucher Program essentially provides rental subsidies that enable poor households to go out in the private market and rent housing. Of those 14,000 households, about 60% of them are either elderly or disabled, have an average income of about $11,000 a year. The remaining 40% are families with children. Their average income is $19,000 a year. And I think you will hear from the panelists today, all of those are absurdly low incomes if you're trying to live in the King County housing market. The third leg of the stool, if you will, is essentially targeted towards what we would call the missing middle, which is folks who are earning too much to be in the federally subsidized programs, but are still struggling and really shelter burdened in the community. And this is what we call workforce housing. Here, there are no government subsidies on the rents. We essentially go out and buy housing on the open market. And by decoupling it from market pressures, what we see is over time, this housing becomes increasingly more affordable as opposed to where the market has gone. We only raise rents as our operating costs go up, which is far less than what we're seeing in the market today, where the disequilibrium really in supply and demand is really driving rents. So we have some 8,000 units of workforce housing, which is really targeting in the 40 to 80% of AMI range. And we also see a fair number of voucher holders in that housing as well. So it really becomes mixed income housing. So I'll really stop there. Essentially, we own about 11,000 units of housing. If the federal programs went away, we'd still be one of the largest landlords in the region. And then we help another 10,000 households through the voucher program. We're housing about 60,000 folks a night. I'll leave it at that.
Wow. Thank you, Stephen. So Patience, how about the Housing Development Consortium of Seattle, King County?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. And once again, I'm Patience Malaba. In terms of the Housing Development Consortium, we are a membership association with more than 190 members who work across the King County region to really ensure that all people, everyone, has the opportunity to live with dignity in safe, healthy, and affordable homes within communities of opportunity. In terms of our work and how that unfolds, we see our work in a threefold way as well, and it's a three-letter. At first, we are an advocate. We advocate for affordable housing, for policies and programs that support and increase the possibility of creating more homes for people who are from the 0 to 80% AMI, as you just had from Steve. We also, beyond just looking at those policies, we advocate for funding because we do recognize just the gap that we have in terms of meeting the need and consistently, sustainably funding housing to make sure that people at those AMI levels get the support that they need. The second letter is we are a broker. We see ourselves as an entity with this 190 plus membership to create cross-sector partnerships across the region and bring people together to create sustainable regional solutions. An example of this recent kind of work is in South King County. We most recently worked on the South King Housing and Homelessness Partners, which is a sub-regional group, really intended to bring together about 10 jurisdictions to tackle the issue of housing and homelessness within the sub-region. So that's an example of some of the brokering partnerships that we have. We're also currently working on the east side as the cities like Bellevue are anticipating the massive growth of about 20,000 jobs that are coming over the next 5 years. We have launched an East Side Affordable Housing Convening and an East Side Housing Roundtable. So that's the kind of brokering of cross-sector partnerships that we're focusing on. And then the third letter is we are a convener. We're convening our members to really build a network for systemic change. We do member service provision by creating those platforms of affinity groups where our members can come together to tackle key issues affecting our sector, whether that is how we become a partner in climate change responses work and really being effective as a sector in that way, or whether it is creating leadership bench and people who will continue to move the sector forward as a part of the work on how we are convening our members and partners. So that's a little bit about the work that we do as HTC, and we look forward to get to hear from this audience any other questions that you may have.
Great, thank you, Patience. Tyrone, how about the Tenants Union? What do you do?
Yeah, thank you. So the Tenants Union, we're a statewide tenant union. We have offices in Seattle, Olympia, Spokane, but we are a statewide organization. Our vision at the TU is to create housing justice. We do that through empowered-based education, outreach, leadership development, organizing, and advocacy. We help, connect power. I mean, as the new statewide organizer, I help connect power throughout across the state. We help people in real time on our tenant rights hotline. And because our work is strongly grounded in the fact that tenants must be the leaders of efforts to transform our housing conditions in our communities, we help them advocate for better statewide and regional tenant protections, fighting for housing access and stability over landlord profit, supporting tenants on the ground and organizing to take collective action against their landlord and assert their rights and resist displacement.
Great, thank you, Tyrone. And Rachael, what about the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance?
Great. Well, thanks for having us all here, Jeff. Again, I'm Rachael Myers, and I'm the director of the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance. I use she, her pronouns. And the Housing Alliance is a statewide advocacy organization. We have a membership base of organizations all across the state, and about 10,000 people who are individual sort of online action members. So we connect with people all across the state on affordable housing issues. Organizations like King County Housing Authority are members of the Housing Alliance, are organizational members of the Housing Alliance. We also work very closely with HDC and the Tenants Union. And we work to change public policy with a vision that everyone in Washington has a safe, healthy, affordable place to live. We primarily work at the state legislative level, but not only at the state legislative level. We work in partnership with other organizations across the country to work on federal housing policy as well. And that's been particularly important during the last year with the pandemic, because the resources needed to prevent just a huge wave of folks losing their housing is much more than any state can handle on their own. So we've been doing a lot more work at the national level this past year. But sort of the thing that we're best known for and that we spend most of our time on is that we develop an annual state legislative agenda every year. And we do that by talking to folks in communities all across the state, by talking to people with lived experience with housing insecurity and homelessness, by talking to organizations who are providing housing and providing services for people experiencing homelessness. And we kind of listen to everybody around the state about what are the barriers really to solving the housing crisis in their communities. And then we develop a state legislative agenda based on that, that we organize advocates across the state to help us enact. And we are in the middle of the legislative session right now, so I'll talk more about that later. The one other thing I'll say is that a big part of our sort of theory of change, what we believe is that we are not short of really great housing policy ideas. We know the solutions. It's not really that complicated, provide housing to everybody. What is missing is the political will. So a big part of our work is organizing people in communities to put constituent pressure on decision makers. So we have an organizing project that works with people who live in affordable housing. We mobilize people in communities across the state to make sure they're lawmakers here, that addressing the housing needs of everybody in every community is a priority. So I'll stop with that.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Taking a step back, just to get everyone on the same page, Stephen, what do we mean by affordable housing? That term is often used, and we just want to get a sense of what that exactly means.
Much abused. I think the traditional rule of thumb is that the costs of the housing, both the rent and utilities, to be considered affordable, has to be below 30% of the total earnings of a family. I think that is an ideal, an aspiration. I think extremely low income households in King County, virtually every household that's below 30% of the area median income. There are over 75,000 renter households who, unless they are being subsidized by one of the housing authorities or one of the nonprofits that's in the HDC membership, they're paying more than 50% of their income for rent and utilities. And when you're paying more than half of your income for rent or utilities, what that means is you're one missed paycheck or one rent increase away from homelessness. And I think this is the situation we're facing today.
Thank you. Patience, I've seen on several of your websites the phrase "housing is a basic human right." What would you say that means, and how would you define that?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Jeff. For me, housing as a basic human right means that everyone has a right to a safe, healthy, decent home that their pocket can afford. It means they should have the ability to choose where they live without barriers that are created by income, that are created by race, that are created by their disability status, or that are created by our regulations that are not protecting them. It's really ensuring that as we look at the housing crisis, as we look at the homelessness crisis, in order for us to get to a place where housing is really recognized by our government as a human right, by our entities across the country as a human right, it's going to take shifting away from seeing housing as a privilege, but going back to the basics of realizing that a safe shelter is a human right. I mean, we don't negotiate breathing. I mean, that's a right. We don't negotiate clean air. That's a right. And that has to happen with housing. But we have commodified housing for so long. We have not really intently, even with the massive amount of policy ideas that we have, gotten to a place where we're treating it as that human right to address the problems that we're facing. So unless we get to that place, we won't be able to address our homelessness and housing crisis.
Thank you, Patience. Tyrone, what are you seeing in the tenants union in terms of trends or patterns in our region for housing?
Thank you, Jeff. I would say, trends would be the basic false selling of affordable housing and what affordable housing is and isn't. That housing is not a basic human rights. And we clearly show that in the ways that we devalue people and enact policies. Racial inequalities that exist within housing. A system that is, not working really on home ownership or land ownership, but for profit. Real estate, profits driving both construction and reform rather than people's actual needs. I think the pandemic has further shown and impacted this. It's further the divide in the moment of crisis, because despite people losing their income, there's still this expectation of paying your rent and considering moving on as if times are still normal. And none of the solutions on the table actually fix the challenges. Landlord profit and equity, they continue to amass as normal, and the casualties continue to be poor communities and communities of color.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyrone. Kind of a similar question to you, Rachael. What are you seeing in terms of trends and patterns, maybe even at the legislation level, pre to current pandemic?
Yeah, a lot to say about that. I think the biggest trend is just the extraordinarily high housing costs in our state and in our region, and the resulting homelessness from that. I think it would be no surprise to anybody that homelessness is just a growing crisis. It's the most visible sign of housing costs being just astronomical. I think that people often, want to look for other reasons for homelessness. Everybody who experiences homelessness has a path that kind of got them to that point. But overall, as a system, the fundamental reason that we're seeing an increase in homelessness is that housing costs are just so high. So that's really the sort of biggest trend. In Seattle and King County area, to be able to afford just the average cost of a pretty basic 2-bedroom apartment, a household would need a full-time wage of $40 an hour to be able to meet that 30% threshold that Stephen talked about, and to have the rest of their income left over for food and transportation and childcare and all those other needs. There was a new report that was actually just released yesterday that shows that in the Seattle King County area, there are 30 affordable and available housing units for every 100 of the lowest income households who need a place to live. So that leaves a really big gap for everybody else. And it's a gap that organizations like the King County Housing Authority are an important part of filling, but there's not the resources because, like Patience said, we're not treating housing as a human right. I think the other, the trend that's really hopeful for me is that, the pandemic has made abundantly clear how critical a home is for everything else, including the ability to stay healthy. Our state legislators, and this started before the pandemic, our state legislators have also begun really prioritizing affordable housing and meaningful solutions to homelessness over the past 5 or so years in a way that we have never seen before. The same thing is starting to happen in Congress. The part of the President Biden's housing plan as he was running for office was essentially to make housing a basic human right. Currently, the number, I believe, is 1 in 4 households in our country that qualifies for housing assistance, that is poor enough that they should be able to get assistance with their housing. 1 in 4 actually gets that assistance because there's not enough money. And President Biden campaigned on the fact that he wanted to make housing universally available for everybody who qualifies. So I think that this sort of trend and recognition that housing actually should be treated like a basic human right is a really hopeful thing that we're beginning to see.
Thank you, Rachael. Back to you, Stephen. Do you have anything to add into what Rachael said about the trends and patterns that you're seeing with King County Housing Authority?
Well, I think she's absolutely dead on right. The fact is we just don't have enough housing. And it's interesting, this is a region of the country which has enjoyed enormous prosperity. And since 2010, we've had a 21% increase in jobs. And no one has ever figured out how to create jobs without having people move here to take them. So we've seen a 12% increase in population, and we've had an 8% increase in housing. So the scarcity of housing is driving cost. And that has got to be the fundamental fix that we have to have. We need more housing production. We need preservation of existing affordable housing in the region. One of the things that this scarcity has done is it's driven up the price of existing housing. And a study by McKinsey last year showed that in the last decade, the region has seen a net reduction of 112,000 units of housing that was affordable to people earning under 80% of the area median income. So even the new production of affordable housing isn't beginning to keep up with the actual inventory loss that we're seeing. So supply is the first piece. And then I think there are a whole array of other issues that need to be fixed, particularly in the homeless arena. But I think that ultimately what this comes down to is the fact that the federal government had traditionally, since the New Deal, been the primary driver in terms of housing resources in this country. They have essentially walked away from this for decades now. And we're seeing the reality that the private sector, the market does not walk into these particular pieces of the demographic, that it is ultimately something the government has to get more engaged with. And I think there is a true beacon of hope on the national level. I've been working with Secretary Fudge's advisors around the issue of a vast expansion of the voucher program. I would acknowledge that Representative Adam Smith has just sponsored a piece of legislation calling for a new $25 billion investment in more vouchers, which I think is a critical first step in this. So everyone, please reach out to Representative Smith, let him know that this is truly a smart move and one that addresses directly critical issue in our neighborhoods. But ultimately, it's going to come down to the will of Congress to significantly invest in this issue and see that in the long term, this is the right solution.
Thanks, Stephen. Patience, this is kind of a big question, but kind of alludes to what we talked about already and what Stephen just mentioned in terms of addressing issues that derive from systemic racist or just systemic institutional racism policies. And so how do you address those issues within the system that created it?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Jeff. I think, and rightfully so, an important one, especially with the racial sort of reckoning that we've seen most recently. How do you address that? I think we start off by recognizing the history of how we got here. Here because we had Jim Crow laws, we had years of slavery, we had racial confidence, we had redlining. And those practices, while they were stopped by specific legislation, they still have remnants that continue within our system. So we still see racial discrimination right now for BIPOC communities in their access to housing. We still see that show up even in their access to jobs, well-paying jobs that can help them be able to afford the housing that they need. So within an existing system, I think we acknowledge that and then go forward into systemic change work. And systemic change work is going to require that we do effective targeted universalism, where as much as our current laws don't allow us to call race, but the policies that created and brought us to where we are today were very race specific. So for us to really get to a place of addressing it, we're going to need to be very intentional in looking at the current recovery. Who is behind in the rents in terms of payments right now? 175,000 renters are behind their rent. And a big proportion of that are mostly BIPOC communities. So how do we recover effectively? Then in terms of funding, of course, I think both Rachael and Steve put it very well on the shortage of homes. We continue to have this huge shortfall of homes. We're not producing at nearly close to the level that we need to help people access the housing that they really need to be in. So how do we make sure going forward that we are funding, supporting the production of housing to really be at scale? And then, of course, we provide other services. And then there's a other big picture of this, that opportunity, that specific jurisdictions have an opportunity for, and that is in the land use and zoning aspect. We still have land use and zoning laws that are reflective of the 1950s. If we're really going to be a forward-thinking region, forward-thinking cities, it's going to mean that we're intentional in looking at the equity impact so far in our existing systems and our growth patterns, and change those to accommodate and really support BIPOC communities that don't have the support so far and historically have not been supported. Number one, to get into rental housing, but number two, to get into home ownership opportunities. If you look at the disparity that we have between white households and Black households in terms of access to home ownership, we still remain lagging behind in that aspect. So it's really going to take political will. It's going to take partnership across all agencies and sectors, bring our heads together to fully bring a shift for systemic change, both locally and also at a national level.
Thanks, Patience. Tyrone, kind of the same question to you. How do we address the systemic issues within this system that created it? And also, how does the tenants union, what specifically do you do to kind of address that?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, Patience so eloquently covered a lot of what I would say, definitely understanding that the past 300 years, our policy has been race specific, and yeah, sure, we did enact the Fair Housing Act, but all that did was to say that we will not tolerate discrimination, right? It didn't go back and reverse the system on which this foundation stands on. So we create these neutral policies for them to only remanifest in discrimination. So I would say, cut allegiance to that system, reframe that system, right? Fix the home ownership gap, devote resources, add protective measures that do actually prevent homelessness, discrimination, and promote permanent stable housing. Since what we do at the TU, a lot of our work, I mean, we see how these inequalities show up because of a lot of our members are people from marginalized communities who cannot access resources, who need help bridging that gap to those resources. So what we do is we're those bridge gappers. We, when people can't show up for them, we show up for them. We go to hearings with them. We help them fill out paperwork. We figure out resources for people without Social Security cards, and just trying to do what we can for tenants on a ground level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rachael, so Tyrone just mentioned one of the challenges is to create policies that lead to systemic change. So what are some key policies that you're working on right now, and what other programs do you offer at the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance for people to get engaged in?
Yeah, so at the federal level, like I said, we've been working much more there recently, largely because of the pandemic and just the enormous need. And partly because I think, like I said before, there is this pretty strong sort of beacon of hope of being able to make some significant changes that we haven't seen in my entire time working in this field. So we have been working really hard over the past year to get Congress to pass significant relief package. And they just, I'm sure you all saw, they just passed the American Rescue Plan Act a couple of weeks ago. That's gonna, that act included actually a little over $25 billion for housing and homelessness response. It's gonna mean over $400 million of additional rental assistance coming to Washington State, and that's going to bring the total rental assistance that our state has to distribute up to something like $983 million, so just under $1 billion. And that's for like emergency response to the pandemic for all the people who have lost income and been unable to pay their rent. So that's been a big piece of our work for the last year. Next week, there's actually going to be a campaign kickoff with folks around the country, led by our partner at the national level, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, to sort of kick off the next steps, things like making housing a universal right. And sort of how do we, if we can solve the immediate crisis, now let's move to, a long-term solution. So I'll leave it at that at the federal level. At the state level, we are working with legislators this year on kind of two things similar to what's happening at the federal level. We've been working really hard to develop what we're calling the off-ramp to the eviction moratorium. So you all may know that the governor implemented a moratorium on evictions at the very beginning of the pandemic. He extended that several times. The last time he extended it was just yesterday. Currently, it is scheduled now to expire June 30th. No matter when that ends, if we don't have systems to protect people in place, we are going to have what we have been calling a tsunami of evictions, which is going to lead to a spike in homelessness because many people aren't going to have any other option. The other thing is that there have been some pretty good studies throughout the last year that show that for states that have not had an eviction moratorium in place, where people were still losing their homes during the pandemic, they were likely to double up with other families, to go to shelters, or to live in a car or a tent and have to go to crowded congregate facilities to access other things like bathrooms and food. And that actually drove more cases of coronavirus. So our eviction moratorium and ensuring that after that ends, people don't lose their homes is a part of the response that we have seen and need to continue to see to the actual health implications of the pandemic. So what we're working on this year is we have three pieces of legislation. One is House Bill 1277, and that would create a permanent statewide rental assistance program funded by a $100 document recording fee that's generally paid when people buy a home, sell a home, refinance a home. And that would generate somewhere in the range of $100 million a year to make sure that Washington, not just, so that when the federal money runs out, we have some additional state resources to meet the rental assistance needs, which existed long before the pandemic. So that's a piece of it. Another piece is House Bill 1236, and that creates what we call just cause or good cause. It would require that landlords have one of a number of legitimate business reasons in order to end a tenancy and make somebody move. We have that currently in Seattle, but most places in the state do not have that, and landlords can issue 20-day no-cause notices, and someone has to be out of their home in 20 days. So that often can hide discrimination or retaliation. It allows landlords to get around all kinds of other, fair housing and anti-discrimination protections, because if they don't have a reason at all, it's very hard to prove that you've been discriminated against or maybe retaliated against for asserting your rights. That would also ensure that the rental assistance money that's coming actually preserves people's homes, keeps people in their homes. What we don't want is to pay people's back rent with this rental assistance money and then have landlords still be able to evict right after they've gotten all their rent paid. So we really want to make sure that the rental assistance and the just cause protection works together to keep people housed. And then the third bill, and then I'll stop, is Senate Bill 5160, and that puts a lot of protections in place around evictions. I think the biggest and most exciting being it provides right to counsel to tenants, low-income tenants who are facing eviction. Currently, almost every landlord is represented in court when they go to court for an eviction. Virtually no tenants, or a very, very small proportion of tenants, have a lawyer. So it's generally the tenant standing next to their landlord's attorney. And you can see the obvious power imbalance of that. In other places that have right to counsel, no other state does, but in cities that have right to counsel, they've seen numbers like 84% of tenancies are preserved when a landlord has representation. So that's another piece that we're working on. And I said I would stop, but I'm going to say one more thing, because the other thing we're working on is sort of the longer term solution. We're asking for a really significant investment in building or acquiring newly affordable housing, $250 million for the State Housing Trust Fund, and also $70 million in the capital budget to purchase hotels and motels and other underused properties so that we can, and there's a lot of these properties on the market right now because they're not being used, so that we can use those for emergency shelter and maybe ultimately transform them into permanent housing if they're able to be rehabbed in that way.
Great. Wow. Thank you. Lots of initiatives happening at the state and federal level. Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to jump to a participant question from Judy for Stephen. Could you please cite examples either in the state or national level of communities or jurisdictions that have successfully addressed the housing crisis with a solution that could be a model for the wider community?
Well, I'm not sure that anybody nationally has really figured it out. And I think part of this is because traditionally the resources have flowed from the federal government and they simply haven't been there. In terms of, though, effective programs that are on the local level, let me talk about a couple that we're doing right here. The first, and this gets back to, I think, the issues around racial disparities that have been alluded to, is there's been a lot of good work done by Raj Chetty. He's an economist at Harvard that has now conclusively, I think, brought the jury back in with the verdict that if you get poor kids into quality communities that have opportunity in terms of jobs, good education, good environments, low crime, that kids prosper. And that the longer you keep them in opportunity communities, the more likelihood that their life outcomes are going to be significantly different. So this notion that neighborhood quality matters, I think, is a fundamental piece of dealing with racial disparities, systemic racism, and long-term outcomes, breaking cycles of poverty. And when we look regionally, that tells us three things. One is we have communities here which have essentially lost economic diversity. And really, I think the East Side is a good example of that. And what we are trying to do there is to prevent the displacement of remaining poor folks who are living in the few remaining naturally affordable, privately owned communities. And we do this by buying them up. And we have bought up apartment complexes on Mercer Island, in Bellevue, right off of Bellevue, Old Main Street, in downtown Kirkland, and turn them into public housing to provide access to good housing in good neighborhoods. We've also bought up complexes which were about to go to market and be sold as value add properties, where the sales prospectus is telling the buyers that given market conditions, they can immediately raise everybody's rent by $400 or $500. And by coming in and buying those properties, we're preventing the dislocation of the existing residents, many long-term residents in those neighborhoods. We're doing the same thing in gentrifying neighborhoods, which is sort of the second bucket. And when you look at areas such as Burien and White Center, which have traditionally been poor neighborhoods, and they're now starting to gentrify, and there's no such thing as a stable mixed income private sector market. It's either going up or it's going down. So what we're doing is we're stepping in to try to assure that even as neighborhoods gentrify, there is a significant amount of affordable housing left in the neighborhood, and that this actually produces a mixed income neighborhood where everybody can benefit. And then, because the reality is at the end of the day, there will still be a majority of poor children living in neighborhoods with other poor children, we have to bring opportunity to those neighborhoods. And this is where the Housing Authority is working with school districts, with the early learning systems, with our families and partners in the community to really figure out how you bring in opportunity. And we have built a network of some 18 after-school centers across the county that work with schools. We've brought in libraries. We've provided land to build new elementary schools. We're really looking to make sure that there is a basic infrastructure in the community that can support everybody. So I think there's this mix between the real estate issues and the community social impact issues that have to be looked at together in creating a truly diverse neighborhood that provides opportunity for everyone. And I think this is one of the key things that we are being relatively successful at here. Some 30% of the extremely low-income households that we support through our federal programs live in what are mapped as high-opportunity neighborhoods. And this is about twice what the national average is in terms of where HUD-subsidized housing is actually located.
Thanks, Stephen. Patience, I want to jump to Christina's question. She appreciates your remarks on racial disparities in home ownership. And her question is, am I right in understanding that the priority is to focus on renters first to avoid people becoming homeless, and then to work on the issue of home ownership? I would love to hear about potential policy improvements to both issues as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, Christina. I think it's important to not keep the issues in specific silos. I think we've tried to work on rental housing and also helping people stay stable even throughout the COVID-19 public emergency. But beyond that, we're also looking at how do we create home ownership opportunities. And when you think of specific legislation or programs to support, I mean, reference the Housing Trust Fund investments. That's a key piece to be supporting right now, $250 million for affordable housing that does include home ownership opportunities. So that's a really big gap to be covering and supporting home ownership opportunities. Beyond that, there's also regulatory aspects, which we have opportunities here locally to be pushing for. When you look at the comprehensive plan amendments that are coming up, and I want to speak specifically of legislation that's being worked on at the state level to support some of that and how that will tie to home ownership opportunities. Currently, there's a bill, House Bill 1220, which is changing the Growth Management Act's housing chapter to consider, especially in housing elements, looking at housing for people who are extremely low income, people who are low income, and also looking at the racially disparate impacts of our policies. And in looking at that, as we open up our cities to not only 75% of most of our residential land really being preserved for detached homes, we can create more opportunities where we don't just have apartments and then a small home here, but we're also covering that missing middle housing type. And that's an opportunity where we can be innovative in creating home ownership opportunities for people who traditionally have not had those opportunities to do that. And while I speak on bills, I also just wanted to talk to the legislative work that we are doing in partnership with the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance at the state level. Another bill that is moving forward that really needs everyone's support is House Bill 1070, which is the bill that really fixes an existing legislation and allows the money that we have seen here locally at King County level with the Health Through Housing Initiative to use some sales tax revenue to purchase hotel motels and enable creation of emergency housing and long-term permanent supportive housing. That bill has been voted in the chamber, in the opposite chamber right now from the committee, and it has been moved on to the House and may be voted on soon. If it does get voted on sooner, it has an emergency clause, and that would enable us locally here to be able to create homes for about 1,600 of our neighbors who have been experiencing chronic homelessness. So just to conclude, it's not an either or on the home ownership. It's really moving at the same time on two key issues that are facing our communities across the state and across the region.
Thanks, Patience. Tyrone, there's a question, and I'll kind of allude to that in the chat, but I want to know, in terms of the tenants union and how you actually do the work. We've talked about advocating for policies, and so how does the community outreach, the activism that you do, turn into policies? How do you actually do that on the ground?
Thank you, Jeff. And yeah, that's a great question. A lot of getting policy passed on a local level and a state level has to do with constituents like coming in and advocating for those policies, coming in and sharing their stories, changing the data. Because right now, oftentimes what we see is a lot of work is done without tenants coming forward. There's nothing but data to be left to be read, right? And when they don't hear the stories in real time, they're not really sure what's going on, So we gather our members, we get them together, we gather stories, we get people to come and testify at these hearings. We get people to sign in pro. We send out action alerts because it's really important for representatives to hear from their constituents, so we send out action alerts so that they can reach out and the representatives know that people are actually rallying behind these bills. A lot of times, like we've seen in recent years, just cause have fallen off in the first week or so, and that's happened because we didn't have the advocacy that we have now. And people are now realizing in this time of the pandemic that it is grassroots organizing that's going to be the most influential, right? And so just showing up to these hearings and paying attention to these bills, and just whether it's using your voice on social media, whether it's using your voice with your neighbors, whether it's using your voice within your organization, just understanding that our voice is power, and as a collective, we can continue to push for the rights that we need.
Thanks, Tyrone. Rachael, how do you do that Low Income Housing Alliance? How do you incorporate community input and community kind of voices into your advocacy work?
Yeah, we do that in a lot of ways. I mean, like I said, we really believe, like Tyrone said, that it's grassroots pressure, it's building political will is what needs to happen. All of us who work in this field bring some kind of level of expertise. Stephen knows very well what it's going to take to develop homes that are going to meet the needs of their residents. But, there's an expertise that comes with knowing what it's going to take, to keep your own family stably housed. And that's just as important, maybe a more important type of expertise. It's interesting now, for all the challenges of everything being remote, the legislature, it being remote, is kind of an amazing opportunity, because you used to have to go all the way to Olympia, take you however long it took you, depending on where you live. Imagine if you live in Spokane during the winter trying to get to Olympia, in order to, meet with your legislator or testify at a hearing and tell your personal story about how you're going to be impacted. Very few people could actually do that. So the people that lawmakers generally heard from were lobbyists. Now you can do that from wherever you are in the state. So we've been seeing, the hearings that we've been having this year, we've been able to, organize tenants to talk about their own personal experiences with not being able to pay their rent, and how important it is that this eviction moratorium is in place, and how important it's going to be for them to have rent assistance. Because, after 6 months or a year of not working, even when they get a job again, they're not going to be able to pay all of that back rent. So those really personal stories have been able to reach legislators directly in a way that has never been possible before. So that's been really, really exciting. I think some of the most powerful testimony and some of the most powerful organizing that's happened this year has been engaging people who can tell their personal stories. The Tenants Union has been a fantastic partner in organizing tenants to talk about their stories. We've got, I think I briefly mentioned that we have a project called the Resident Action Project, where we work with low-income people who live in affordable housing or need to wish they lived in affordable housing. And we're doing some organizing in those communities. And, so we've been bringing folks to come and testify and share their personal stories. I often say, and I think this is true, I really do think it's true that, that legislators, they spend all day usually talking to lobbyists and thinking about complicated budgets and policy, but the things that really resonate, the things that really stick with them, the things that are in their heads when they're falling asleep at night are the story of the constituent whose life has been changed by the public policy that they're working on, or whose life will be changed by that public policy. I think those stories are incredibly powerful. And it's a risk. It's scary to tell your personal story. We do a lot of work to really support people. And I know the Tenants Union does that too. And I think HDC, you probably do some of this as well. We do a lot of work to really support people and make sure that folks feel good and it's an empowering experience. But yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most important things that we're doing this year, and that we do every year, but that we have a better way to do this year.
Thanks, Rachael. Stephen, there's two questions. I'm trying to mesh them together. One from Judy: what are the primary sources of King County Housing Authority funding being used to finance purchase of local housing complexes? And then sort of a related question from Doug: There's so much talk about money. If you see that, he has quite the comment. H-Bill 1277 targets 100 million more a year. Housing Trust Fund seeking 250 million, 70 million to purchase hotels. How can we put all this funding money issues together to make sense of it so that the layperson knows what's going on? So that's kind of
like a Doug question. Yeah. So on the first question, when we buy these complexes, we buy them with borrowed money. We go out on the bond market and issue bonds to essentially purchase the properties. But because we can't drop the rents when we buy them because we have to pay off the purchase, but we only raise the rents as our operating costs go up. And the pricing on when you buy these on the open market is predicated on the assumption you're going to aggressively push rents. And then because most of these properties are being bought by equity companies or REITs, that in 5 or 6 years, you're going to sell them and cash in on the appreciation on the asset. We're buying them for a long-term hold. We're not pushing the rents. So the reality is that the rents we get can typically only cover about 60% of the debt that it takes to buy them. So we started doing this really back in the mid-1990s, and we have a pool of properties that have paid off a lot of their underlying debt, so they have some cash flow. So what we were doing for years were we were combining the debt from the new properties in with the debt from the old properties, and as a pool, they could cover the additional expense. Problem is we ran out of pools to refinance. So for the last 2 or 3 years, we've been working with the corporate sector to get below market debt from them. And to their credit, Microsoft and Amazon have recognized that the jobs that they are bringing, particularly to the East Side, is driving a lot of the market pricing on the rental housing because the demand is accelerating as more people move into the neighborhood. Their employees don't need any help. They get enough money for the most part in the corporate headquarters to afford housing on the open market. But they recognize that the impact of their expansion of the job base was essentially forcing out all of the essential lower income workers in the community. The folks who clean the windows and cut the hedges and serve the food in the Microsoft and Amazon offices, the dental technicians, the espresso folks, the folks who work in all of the retail industries on the East Side were living further and further away. Many of them are living now in Pierce or Snohomish counties. And the reality is they were traveling every day on 405, and you can't put another lane on 405. So this isn't working. It isn't working on an environmental sustainability front. It isn't working in terms of being a viable community. You started to hollow out the community. You started to create segregated portions of the region. So to their credit, when we came to them and we said, we have targeted several thousand units of remaining affordable housing on the East Side. We want to buy it. We want to decommodify it. We want to take it off the market and keep it affordable for the people who are now living there and for folks who are in lower wage jobs in the region. They step forward, and we've gotten about $250 million in low interest loans from them. We still have to pay them back, but the loans sit for 15 or 20 years while we pay off the underlying principal that we have on the bonds, and then we take care of that with the cash flow at that point. To Doug's question, the McKinsey study looked at the overarching need for housing in the region, and McKinsey is a private sector consultant who is very used to working with the private sector. And they came back and they said, and this was a study initially, I believe, commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce. They said there is a chunk of this in terms of housing for folks earning less than 80% of AMI that the private market is not going to address. The numbers don't pencil for them. And the unfortunate reality is the need for government intervention in here is measured in the billions, not the millions of dollars. And that is daunting until you look at what we spend on transportation projects in the region, what we spend on other infrastructure projects. And the reality is that this is a fundamental piece of our community, both from the perspective of human rights, both from the perspective of dealing with racial injustices and segregation and all of the systemic racism that has put us into the position we're in, but also in terms of the long-term good of this community, in terms of being a sustainable economic prospect. This is what you need, is this kind of investment. And I think every level, from local to state to federal, has to chip in. But the sad reality is yes, it is a big number, but it's the kind of investment in our future as a region that we have to make. We don't have a choice.
Thanks, Stephen. We only have a few minutes left for this panel discussion, but as a reminder, we will be having breakout groups with the speakers, so you're welcome to ask them questions in those breakout rooms in just a few minutes. So I'd like to just, in the last few minutes, Patience, what would you say, how can people get involved to support your work and or just get involved in housing issues in general?
Well, thanks for asking that, Jeff. One way to get involved is to sign up for our advocacy alerts. I will put that in the chat as well. In terms of ongoing local advocacy as it comes online, I invite all of you, even for the most boring conversations like comprehensive plans, which are never exciting for anyone who does not like any nerdy conversations, show up for that, testify, speak your opinion and support. I think it's always important. At the state level, we have been fortunate this year, to Rachael's point, on just that access, that remote access, which we would normally have to drive hours for. But now you just have to use a link to sign in pro, you use a link to submit your written comment. So there's a lot of accessibility that has been made possible by the emergency that we're in right now. And then in terms of other ongoing work, I mean, start organizing your neighbors, start talking to your neighbors, start just sharing your story, especially if you are impacted by housing instability. Just be committed to share that. Legislators don't always have the opportunity to hear from their constituents. And I think it's always very important and far much more powerful for you to share your personal story. So that will be one of the ways that I think folks can stay really engaged in this work.
Thanks, Patience. Tyrone, the same question. How can people support your work and just housing issues in general?
Yeah, I'm gonna second what Patience says about showing up. I would think that's the most important, showing up, understanding that our voices are what matters. You know, it's local and state policies that that are made affect us in our everyday life. So we should be using our voices to affect those policies as well. The tenants unions, we offer a lot of educational based training as far as knowing your rights. Even if you know your rights or maybe a little bit, coming to those trainings, and then peer education, resharing that knowledge with your neighbors and your friends, whether you're a tenant or not. We all know somebody who is a renter. We do email lists, signing onto our email list. You can do that by going to thetenantsunion.org. That will allow you to be emailed our action alerts and then resending those out. Coming to direct actions, we do direct actions at different apartment buildings that are holding landlords accountable. Coming to those direct actions, we do direct actions surrounding legislation, so showing up to those. Donating, and also, like I said, becoming a member, and just using like your networks and collaborating with other people who also whose also work intersects within housing. And by doing that, understanding that every issue is not a single issue, all these issues are intersectional.
Thank you, Tyrone. Rachael, the same question. How can people support your work?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll share again the link to sign up for our action alerts. We have a pretty active email list, and that's because there's so much going on. And so we give folks lots of opportunities to weigh in, and send messages to their lawmakers. We try to make it as easy as possible for folks to do that. So you can sign up on our list there. If you're someone who is more involved, who wants to get more involved, we have a program called Legislative District Leads. So for folks who want to help sort of mobilize people in their own legislative district and who have a network that you want to mobilize, we can get you involved in that program, and then we'll have some ways for you to, not just take action yourself, but engage your community and your network in action. So if you're interested in that, I'll drop my email address in the chat again. You can reach out to me for that. If you work with low-income people or people who, or if you are a low-income person or you live in affordable housing and want to get involved in our resident action project, that's another opportunity. But I really think that, it doesn't feel like it might not feel like you're really doing something significant, but these messages going to lawmakers, as they're making decisions are really, really important. And we hear from lawmakers all the time that, they're counting how many messages they get in support of this bill or that bill. So it really does make a difference when you take an action, if you can customize and personalize your action. So, we usually give you a sample letter to send, but if you want to say, I'm Rachel and this is why this matters to me. I know someone who is experiencing homelessness or someone in my family has this going on. If you can customize it, that makes it even more powerful. But don't ever think that those messages don't make a difference. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for this panel discussion. I'd like to transition now to the breakout rooms. And participants, just so you know, the panelists have been generous enough to join us in these breakout rooms, and there'll be one in each room, well, 4. You're welcome to join the room of your choice. And to do that, you go to the either 3 dots and more button on the bottom or breakout room, depending on your Zoom configuration. And you click on that and you'll see the opportunity to join a breakout room, and you can just click on the number to join that room. You can leave a breakout room at any time, but I'd caution that you don't leave the webinar altogether. There's a leave the breakout room and then a blue button that says leave breakout. So so do that, and we'll reconvene in about 20 minutes for final thoughts from the speakers. And what I'd suggest is to introduce yourself, why you're interested in the subject, and think about what we can do individually and collectively to address, create and support healthy, affordable housing. So, and as Casey put in the chat, we will not be recording these. So feel free to speak up and ask your questions as you see fit. And so let's jump into the breakout rooms.
Down.
So it looks like we're all back together. Is that right, Casey?
Yep.
So for the final stretch here, if people, I'd invite people to share kind of maybe a key takeaway or insight they had, or kind of one idea they might have to address the housing crisis in the chat. And I want to give the speakers kind of the closing moments, their final thoughts. So let's start with Stephen. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or reflections for people to consider?
Well, I think what I heard and saw in the chat room was a real appetite for solutions. And what I would say to you is that the key solution is we need more affordable housing, and that the key driver of that is going to be the federal government. And we have some terrific heroes out in the region. It's a little bit carrying coals to Newcastle, but Senator Murray on the appropriations side, Senator Cantwell and Representative Del Bene in terms of the low-income housing tax credits, Representative Smith in terms of expansion of the voucher program. All of these folks need to hear from their constituents that this is the right path to go, that the neighborhood and the communities care about affordable housing. They want to see the federal government invest in that. And I think that is one of the most impactful things that folks on this convening can do once the call ends. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Patience, do you have any final closing thoughts?
Yeah, I will emphasize Steve's point on really making sure that your legislators are hearing from you, specifically on the funding piece. There's a lot that's happening at the federal level. We, of course, do have hope with the new administration, but we do need to be really pushing harder, specifically on the affordable housing development side. Look at the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act as well, and push voices there for more support. There was a fix at the end of 2020 to the low-income housing tax credit, but that's not enough for Washington State. In order for us to see more projects, we do need to push for a 50% bond tax reduction that's moving forward. So we do have a webinar coming up. I do want to invite folks, be aware that it's on the HDC website on March 26th. We'll have some of our federal partners discussing those issues. And then the final point here before I take a lot of time is going to be even here locally. Let's recognize that as much as you hear numbers about funding that's out there, it's not enough. The McKinsey report that was referenced earlier says that we need to be spending $400 million up to $1.1 billion per year just to address this issue. So we're nowhere close to meeting that need. So I do encourage you to continue to amplify your voices for more funding for affordable housing, and of course, other policies that are moving along to support people to stay housed, and regulatory pieces that are moving as well to open up opportunities for people to have access and choices of housing across our region.
Thank you, Patience. Tyrone, what are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Just seconding what they already said. They said a lot of great points for sure. But just remembering to use your voice, collective action, and commitment to people staying home, building people power, showing up, and continuing to show up. Remain curious, continue to research knowledge, and then share that knowledge with people. Understand that even though we're working on these national level policies, these state level policies, and these local policies, people are still being displaced in real time, so figuring out how to not only take care of the long-term solution, but to take care of the short-term and the everyday solution as well. And that comes from mutual aid as well as collective aid too. And just really want to thank everybody for showing up, being here, being curious, and asking questions.
Thanks, Tyrone. Rachel, what are your final thoughts?
Really nothing to add. Yeah, use your voice, make sure the people that you elect know that you expect them to take leadership on solving these problems, hold them accountable to that, send them emails, call them when they're making decisions, and vote for people who promise to do the things that, that we know our communities need.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate all the participants and speakers. I have to thank our Civic Bootcamp sponsor, Alaska Airlines, for helping support us in our boot camps. Everyone, please join us next week, March 26th, for a second webinar on the homelessness crisis. And we're going to feature the speakers, Teresa Barker, community organizer with Ravenna Cowan Neighborhood Association, Maureen Ewing, executive director of the University Heights Center, Christopher Park, Metropolitan Improvement District Manager with Downtown Seattle Association, and Dawn Whitson, Outreach Case Manager for REACH. So I really appreciate everyone joining us today, and please take care, and we'll hopefully see you next week.